Hi everyone, and welcome to today's SAM webinar. Today we're going to talk about a new community solar financial model that we'll be releasing later this year. My name is Paul Gilman. This webinar is the third in a series of 4 webinars that we're offering this year. We have one more coming up in a couple of weeks on the latest updates to SAM's bill calculator updates. To the bill calculator. You can register for free for these events on the SAM website on the events page. We'll have recordings for this webinar series, links to recordings on that events page for the next month or so. And then we have recordings for all of our webinars on the various topic pages of the SAM website. So if you go to sam.nrel.gov and look around at the various videos pages, you'll find recordings to all the webinars that we've given over the years. If you have a question during today's session, please use the questions box to type it, and we'll either type an answer in the question box, or we'll pause the session to answer it live. I've got my colleagues on the SAM team ready to help answer questions in the questions box. So today we're going to provide a quick background on SAM, and I'll give you an overview of the new community solar model, and then I will demonstrate it in a beta version of SAM, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So I'm demonstrating this new model. It's not available in the current version of SAM. It will be available in the fall winter 2021 version. We do have a beta version available for download. So if you're interested in seeing the community solar model as it stands currently and maybe provide us some feedback on it, we'd really appreciate that. We'll provide links for those beta version downloads in the chat box. All right, so first a quick overview of SAM in case you're new to the model. It's the System Advisor model. It's free software that's developed and distributed by NREL. And it fundamentally does 2 things. It calculates a power system's electricity output over a year, and then it calculates a power project's cash flow over multiple years of operation. There's an introduction to SAM video if you're just getting started with it that provides a more in-depth introduction, and that's available on the front page of the SAM website. So let's talk a little bit about community solar. Community solar is a financing mechanism that allows a group of people to invest in and benefit from a solar power project. These projects are typically complicated to model because they involve a lot of different partners, involve different kinds of costs, and use a wide range of mechanisms to cover these costs. And they're also subject to rules and requirements that vary by location. So SAM's community solar model is designed to provide a high-level insights into the cost effectiveness of community solar for potential partners in a specific project, or for people who are involved in designing or evaluating the design of a community solar program. The SAM's cash flow model calculates the cost of installing, owning, and operating the solar power system that's part of a community solar project. So it considers a system owner who owns and operates the system and also manages the community solar project. It also provides some insight from the subscriber perspective who pay to participate in the system and benefit from a reduction in their electricity bill. So the system owner perspective involves the solar power systems design, project costs and financing, and the community solar project costs and revenue. So the system is the design of the system, so things like its location and size, the orientation of the PV array, shading, and other aspects of the physical system. It also includes the cost of installing and operating the system, such as for equipment purchases, labor costs, permitting, interconnection, and also project financing, so aspects like debt, taxes, and incentives. The community solar project includes costs associated with acquiring and managing the subscriptions, and also revenue to the project from subscriber payments. So if you're already familiar with SAM, the system design, costs, financial parameters, and incentives will be familiar because the community solar inputs for those parts of the model are the same as those for the PPA single owner financial model. The new community solar model has additional inputs for the subscriber share and costs and revenue associated with the community solar project. So if you've been using the single owner model already for community solar projects, sort of hacking the current single owner model, the transition to this new community solar model should be easy. So as with the other financial models in SAM, we've tried to design the community solar model to have enough detail to cover different modeling scenarios, but not so much detail that it's too difficult to learn and use. So with that in mind, we've divided the community solar costs into an upfront cost in year 0 of the project cash flow, and then a recurring cost that occurs in years 1 through the project life. So it may be that you have a much more detailed cost model for your project with lots of different categories of upfront and recurring costs. If that is the case, you'll need to do some processing outside of SAM to add up those costs so they fit into SAM's simpler categories. So for revenue, the community solar project can earn revenue from different kinds of subscriber payments. There's upfront payments. That's a one-time subscription fee that the subscriber would pay to join the project. And that's in year 0 of the project cash flow. There could be a recurring payment, which would be an annual subscription fee. So typically subscribers would pay a monthly fee, but since SAM is uses an annual cash flow, you'll need to add up those monthly payments to provide an annual value to SAM. And then a generation payment is an annual payment for a portion of the electricity generated by the system that depends on the subscriber's share of the system. So usually a project would get revenue from either these recurring payments or a generation payment, probably not both simultaneously. And then there may be an upfront fee to join that would be in combination with either a recurring payment or a generation payment. For subscribers, SAM supports up to 4 subscriber classes, and you allocate a share of the system to each subscriber class, and the subscriber's share can either be fixed, so stay constant throughout the analysis period, or it could grow or decline for that matter over the project life. And you can also specify the subscriber share by year if you expect subscriber share to change in an irregular way over time. And there's also an option to specify an unsubscribed rate for projects that earn revenue from the unsubscribed portion of the project. And we also provide a bill credit rate that provides a way to assess the value of participating in the project from the perspective of each subscriber class. So the community solar model generates a complete set of results. So we have all the hourly and sub-hourly time series data from the performance model that you can explore, and we have annual cash flow line items as well. But the main output metrics that we'll be focusing on for the community solar model are the project's net present value. So that's calculated from the project's after-tax cash flow, and then also the subscriber net present value if you're considering the subscriber perspective. And just a reminder of what the NPV is, the net present value. So it's a metric that considers all of the project costs and benefits, starting with the year the system is installed through the end of the analysis period. So it includes all installation and operating costs and debt costs and so on. It's an all-in metric. And a positive net present value indicates that the project earns sufficient revenue to cover its costs and earn a return. And a negative NPV indicates the project costs more than the revenue it generates. So that's all I had for the sort of high-level introduction to the model before we take a look at it live. I'll pause to see if there's any questions so far or comments. Okay, so this is the beta version of SAM that has the community solar model in it, and I'm just going to add, I'm going to put links to download the beta version for Windows and Mac in the chat window. So if you're interested in trying this model out, feel free to do so. The beta version has this red banner at the very top that tells you you're using a beta version. The beta version will expire in a few months, so after a while it will stop working. So it's just designed for you to use temporarily to test new features in SAM. The beta version is not fully tested or documented, so if you are using the beta version, just be aware that the results are not going to be necessarily reliable. I wouldn't use it for any real analysis. Wait for the community solar model to be available in the official version to do that. And also, if you do choose to install the beta version, you can install it next side by side with the current version of SAM. The two install in completely separate folders, and you can run them simultaneously. They don't interfere with each other. But just keep in mind that any files that you create in the beta version, you won't be able to open in the current version of SAM. You should be able to open them in the next version. So yeah, just some notes in case you're interested in helping us provide some feedback on this model. As you know, always you can contact us at sam.support@nrel.gov with feedback or questions about this beta version. As you know, to create a case in SAM, you just create this, click the Start a New Project button on the welcome page. And then for now, the community solar model is only available with PV watts. That's just for this beta test version. We will, for the release, we'll make it available with the detailed PV model and also with these PV storage models. So you can evaluate systems with storage for community solar. But for now, we'll just take a look with the PV watts model. So I'll click community solar. That creates a new case here. And so we have the usual inputs for PV watts, which is the location and resource page with a default location of Phoenix, Arizona. If you're modeling a project, you would type in an address here and download a weather file for your location. But we'll go ahead and work with the Phoenix, Arizona default location. And then on the system design page is where you design your PV array using the PV watts inputs. And we're looking at a 1 megawatt project here that's at fixed open rack, so that implies a ground mounted system. And then we have these grid limits inputs which do not apply here. We could impose those, but by default they're off. And then we have this default degradation. So this is accounting for the fact that the output of the PV array is going to degrade over time as the modules degrade. We're just going with this default value of 0.5% per year, but that's a number that you can change. And for this demo, we're just using this default cost of roughly $1 per watt, $1 per watt DC of installed capacity. So that's the upfront cost for installing the project, installing the physical system. And then we also have annual operating costs. So if you're familiar with SAM, these inputs used to be on the bottom of the system cost page. But for this upcoming version, we've now split the installation and operating cost inputs onto separate pages because we're going to add some additional operating costs, including this land lease. So that'll be another new feature in the next version of SAM. For this community solar demonstration, there's no land lease cost. There is an annual cost of $17 per kilowatt. And so that would be to account for things like replacing inverters and maintaining the system. And then we'll just skip over for a second to the financial parameters page to take a quick look at what these defaults are here. This is a project that's financed with 60% debt. The system owner pays income tax at these rates for federal and state income tax, or for the federal and state. And there's some additional costs associated with debt, construction financing costs, and so on that are, we're just going with the default values. We're also assuming that this project can take the 26% ITC, and there's a depreciation sort of breakdown here. It's mostly 5-year makers, but it's broken down into different depreciation categories. Again, just the default assumptions. But the new page is this community solar input page. So this is where we describe the structure of the community solar project. So we start up here at the top with the subscriber share. So there's a number of ways different community solar projects define the subscriber's share of the project. We settled on a percentage of the system's capacity. You can have up to 4 different subscribers classes. In this case, I've just named 2, an anchor subscriber and a general subscriber. But you could have additional classes here if you had residential and LMI or subsidized and unsubsidized, various terms that are used to describe subscriber classes. We've made the subscriber class name an input, so you can use whatever name is consistent with your project. So here I just have 2 subscriber classes, an anchor and a general, and it's not fully subscribed. There's 40% of the project that is not subscribed. And the general subscriber class is growing at an annual rate of 1% per year. And the anchor growth rate is flat. So we're just assuming that the anchor is in, they're committed to the whole project, and then the other subscriber class will grow over time. So obviously you can change these numbers to whatever you like. This is just the example that I'm giving here. If the subscriber growth rate is not going to be constant, as we're doing here, you can use this value schedule button, which you may be familiar with from other input pages in SAM. When you click this little blue-gray button, it turns the box into a button, an edit button. You click that edit button, and now we have a table with values for each year in the analysis period. This is a 25-year project that we've defined on the financial parameters page. So there's 25 rows in the table, and then you can enter the expected subscription rate for the general class explicitly here. So you could say maybe it's going to be 20% for the first 5 years, and then there's going to be a big marketing push in year 6 where you want to get the level up to 40%. So that just makes it possible to model a nonlinear growth pattern for the subscription share or subscriber shares. I'll stick with our linear growth rate here for this example. The next section here is for the subscriber bill credits. So you only need to put numbers in here if you're interested in assessing the project from the subscriber perspective. And this is a little tricky here because by subscriber perspective, I mean the entire subscriber class. So if the subscriber class is going to receive a bill credit, you can put that number in here. And then what Sam will do is compare the cost of buying electricity, the portion of the system power generated, that is, at this rate, to participating in the community solar project. So it gives you a way of comparing participation and to non-participation from the perspective of a given subscriber class. And these again can be entered as a value with a escalation rate or as explicit values in a table. Next is subscription revenue. So this is revenue to the community solar project, to the system owner, which are one and the same in the model here. And here are the 3 different forms of revenue that I discussed in the presentation. We've got an upfront payment, so that might be a fee that the subscriber pays upfront. And then you've got, this would be an annual subscription. So this would, in real life would be the monthly subscription rate. And then the generation rate. So that would be if the subscribers pay per unit of energy rather than a fixed annual fee. If you try to specify both, Sam gives you this little red warning saying that you've specified both annual and generation payments for a single subscriber class. That's typically not allowed, so we generate this red message here warning you about that. But Sam won't prevent you from running a simulation with 2 different sources of payments, but we do display this warning just in case you made a mistake. So I'll set that back to 0 so the message goes away. And then these payments here, this is for the entire subscriber class. So when you're entering the data here, you should consider the this dollar amount to be not the dollar amount that a single subscriber pays, but the dollar amount that the entire class pays. So you have to be a little bit careful to make sure these numbers are consistent with your share of capacity here. And then finally, there's these upfront and recurring costs, which are these are costs associated with managing the community solar project. So, sometimes there's costs associated with acquiring subscribers and with keeping them subscribed and, recruiting new subscribers. So the upfront cost can be specified as a fixed cost or a cost that scales with the size of the system. And then the recurring costs, these are, very similar to the project operating costs here. You can specify them either as a fixed annual cost, an annual cost that scales with the size of the system, or an annual cost that scales with the amount of energy the system generates. So let's take a look at what the results are for this this particular project, which is a imaginary project. It's not based on a real one. We'll try to come up with some examples of different community solar structures modeled in SAM and provide those sample files with this new version. But this example here is just one that I sort of made up to demonstrate the way the model works. And I guess I didn't mention here in the revenue section, there's a revenue for the unsubscribed portion of the project. So this case, we've assumed that the project will receive 3 cents per kilowatt hour for any electricity generated that is not part of the subscription. Okay, so we'll run a simulation here. And on the summary tab, we have some metrics that should be familiar from the other financial models and some new ones. So these metrics here are the performance metrics. So how much energy the system generated, electricity. It's the system's capacity factor and energy yield. And then we have a set of metrics for the owner. So from the owner's perspective, they get a net present value of $50,000. So that's positive. There's also internal rate of return and some other metrics that you can use to evaluate the project. And then from the subscriber perspective, we specified 2 subscriber classes on the inputs here. So we get results for 2 subscribers, and the underlying code doesn't know what these subscriber names are. So they're just, there's subscriber 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this table just provides a little map from the subscriber name that you provided to the subscriber number. So subscriber 1 is the anchor tenant, and they have a negative NPV, but the general class has a positive NPV. So what these metrics are telling us is that from the owner's perspective, this is a profitable project given our assumptions, and that it's not terribly attractive for the anchor tenant. So we may need to make some adjustments to our assumptions to make this project attractive for an anchor tenant. But that for the general subscriber class, they get a positive net present value, so that is likely to be attractive to them. These metrics are based on the project cash flow, which we can see on the cash flow tab. So this is the detailed cash flow that SAM uses to calculate that after-tax cash flow at the bottom of this table. And you'll see there are the revenue here is from the subscriptions. You get a revenue from each subscriber class. There's also some revenue for the unsubscribed portion of the system generation. And then for operating expenses, we have our O&M costs associated with the system, and then we have these community solar costs down here, and those add up to the total operating expense for the project. Otherwise, the remaining cash flow is the same as for the single owner financial model. I thought I'd show a quick demo of one way to address this question of the anchor net present value being negative. If there's a way we could improve the design of our project to give the anchor subscriber a positive NPV. So we can adjust, we can either reduce the project costs to try to make the So when you're adjusting the parameters here, you can either focus on the system owner or on the subscriber. So here we're looking at a subscriber. The project is penciling out for the system owner. So what I want to do is look and see if we can find a subscription rate for the anchor tenant that will give them a positive net present value, but also give the project a positive net present value. And that's given this subscriber bill credit rate of 10 cents per kilowatt hour for the anchor tenant. So what I'm going to try first is varying this annual payment amount. And I could do that just by typing in I could try lowering it a little bit and then running a simulation and looking at the net present value. It's still negative. This is positive. I could go back and change the number again. So that's one way to do this kind of a optimization or solution search analysis. But instead, I'm going to use this Parametrics tool, which kind of automates the process of assigning multiple values to a variable. So that's here under the Simulate button. I'll click Parametrics. And what I need to do is tell SAM what input variable I want to vary and what output variable I'm interested in looking at. So the input variable I want to vary is the this annual payment amount for the subscriber 1 class, and the output metric that I'm looking at is the owner NPV and the subscriber 1 NPV. So let's set that up on the Parametrics input page. I'll click Quick Setup here to set up the input. So I click Quick Setup, that opens this little window, and I'm going to add a variable. I'm going to add an input variable, and it's a subscriber input. So I'm just going to search for variables that have subscriber in the name, and it's under revenue here. It's the subscriber class 1 annual payment. So this is our input. There's that $80,000 value that I put in on the community solar page. I'm going to edit this variable, so I can either double click the name here or click this edit button. And I want to put in a range. Let's try $50,000 to $100,000. This is for the annual payment for the anchor class. So I put in a range there and put in an increment of $10,000. So this will give me, or maybe 5. So this will, if I click update here, this will generate a range of numbers from 50,000 to 100,000 in increments of $5,000. Okay, so those values, just confirming that those are the ones I want. And click OK. And here's the list of input values that are going to be assigned to this variable. Click OK to apply it to this table. Yes, I want to overwrite the table. All right, so now I have my subscriber class 1 annual payment variable with a range of values in the table. The next step is assign the outputs. So I wanted those 2 net present values. So we'll take the project net present value, which is this one here, project return after tax NPV, and then the net benefit for subscriber 1 class. That's not the NPV. So we'll try searching for NPV and subscriber 1 net present value. Okay, so we're gonna show 2 output metrics in the table here. I click run simulations up here, so I'm gonna run a set of parametric simulations. This is gonna run a simulation for each value in the table and then give me results in the table. So this table column here, this is the project NPV, And it's kind of showing me the break-even point here where the NPV goes from negative to positive. It's somewhere between an annual payment of $75,000 and $80,000 for the subscriber one class. From the subscriber perspective, the NPV goes from positive to negative at somewhere between $65,000 and $70,000. So based on these results, it doesn't look like that there's an annual payment amount that will result in an NPV for both the project, the system owner, and the anchor tenant. So that means I need to make some other adjustment. And so what I'll try, just for an example here, there's a number of things you could try, but I'm going to try adjusting the bill credit rate. So I'm going to change it from 10 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour, and then go back to the parametrics page and rerun that simulation now for the new bill credit rate. And then now this moved the break-even point for the subscriber down, and I have an annual payment amount that will result in a positive net present value for both the project and the anchor tenant. So that's $80,000. I can go back to the community solar page and type that in here and run a simulation now. And now I have results with NPV for a positive NPV for everybody. And so I can explore the cash flow in more detail for that set of assumptions. So that's my quick introduction to this new model. Are there any questions or comments?
Hi, Paul. We do have some questions that we've been collecting a little bit, so I'll go ahead and start going through those. The first question that came in was just asking a little bit about the history of why we are adding this model and the development of the model at NREL.
Yeah, well, I think there's been a group at NREL that's been working on community solar over the past few years, and working with some partners out in the industry on community solar projects. So that's part of the impetus for us. And then it's also kind of an new emerging financial structure that we're seeing out in the market, and that people have been requesting that we develop. I think for a while we've just been telling people that they could use the single owner model, and sort of treat these value streams as incentives. So you could kind of hack, as I mentioned in the presentation, you can kind of hack the single owner model to represent a community solar structure. But based on the requests we were getting and work that's being done internally at NREL, we decided to just create the model so you could explicitly model these projects.
Great, thank you, Paul. We had a question also about whether or not it's possible to add a battery to the community solar project, but perhaps more generally, what technologies this model will be available for.
Yeah, so right now it's only available for the PV watts model, and that's just because we want to iron out all the kinks in the financial model and make sure it works before we add it to the other financial models. But in the official release version, community solar will be available with the detailed PV model and with the detailed PV and PV watts battery financial models, and potentially the generic system battery as well. So It's right now, we're limiting it to the PV, to the models that can model PV systems, because that's kind of where most of the community solar development is happening at the moment. But as things evolve, if there's demand for adding it to the other performance models, then we'll be able to do that in future versions.
Thanks, Paul. And speaking of the release, we've had a question or two about what the timeline is for the release of this model.
Yeah, so we're working on a new version of SAM with lots of new features. We've all been very busy over the last few months, and we'll be even busier in the next couple. And that, we hope to get that out around November of 2021. But we won't release it until the models are ready. So that date could slip a little bit, but generally, sort of this winter is when we're aiming to release a new version of SAM that will include this community solar financial model.
Excellent. There are a couple of questions here asking about sort of different forms of community-owned solar projects. So for example, where a co-op might own the project, and so the subscribers are also the owners.
Right. So that's the tricky thing about any financial model like this. It's it's true for the single owner model. It's true here. It's even more true for the community solar model, because the ownership structures of actual projects are really varied. And so you've got everything, owners could be nonprofits, they could be governments, they could be private companies. And really, SAM is pretty agnostic to who the owner is. If you can describe the owner's financial sort of obligations, I guess, to the project on using the parameters on this page, then the entity, it could represent any entity. So for example, if the owner is a nonprofit or a city that doesn't pay income tax, then you can just set the tax rates to 0. So then now this single owner becomes a tax-free entity. Or similarly, if the project is not financed by debt, you can just set the debt percent to 0, and then that removes debt from the equation. So in the situation where the subscribers are also the owners, you would just have to set things up. There would still be some sort of a representation of ownership that's different from the representation of participation in the project. So there shouldn't be any reason why you couldn't set things up in SAM to model that scenario. But really, that's the purpose of this beta test. So it'd be fantastic if you were interested in helping us. We could work with you to try to set up the project that you're trying to model and see if we run up against any limitations, and perhaps some things that we could change in the model to make it possible to model that particular structure.
Great, thanks, Paul. There is also a question talking about different sort of financing setups, asking about if there is a way to add multiple investors to the financials, such as an ITC investor and then a second investor buyout after a specified number of years.
Right. So SAM does have these partnership flip financial models. I'll just show you them here. So we've got a leveraged partnership flip that involves debt, and the partnership flip with no debt, and a sale leaseback. So these are all structures where there are two partners in the project, one with the tax appetite to benefit from the ITC, and the other developer without. We haven't set up the community solar model for those structures, but it's something that could come in the future if there's interest and funding for that development.
Great, thanks, Paul. There's a question here about why why the subscriber class is limited to only 4 options.
Yeah, we had to decide how many to put in there. The main reason is that it's just a pain in the butt to manage a whole lot of variables. And so we wanted to provide enough classes to cover most cases. And 4 seemed like one that covered most of the ones that the folks involved in providing us feedback so far have seen. So it's a little bit similar to, if you're familiar with the PV, detailed PV model, where you can have up to 4 subarrays, but people want to model a system with 6 subarrays. It's SAM's not set up to do that, and it's just basically about managing. It's a computer engineering question about managing a large number of input variables and output variables. So for each of these subscriber classes, we have a complete set of inputs. So there's 4 sets of inputs for all of these, and then we also have 4 sets of outputs in the cash flow and in the metrics table. So it's really just there's no physical reason why we couldn't have more, but we just limited it to 4 for now.
Excellent. A couple more financial related questions. There's a 2-part question here about what value to assume for O&M costs, and then also what is makers. How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, so in general, when you're using SAM, you'll notice that there are a lot of inputs, and we provide default values for all of the inputs. So the reason we do that is so that when you're using the model, you can just create a new community solar project and run a simulation and get results right away. So you can start exploring the model and looking at the inputs and outputs without having to get any data together first. So the purpose for the defaults is to help you get up and running. A secondary purpose, but also important one, is to have reasonable values for numbers that you don't have any data for in your project. So you might not have any information about, for example, the system losses for your project. So we would just recommend that you go with the default values unless you have reason to change them. The same thing goes on the cost and financing side of things. We've got these default installation costs, which are drawn from annual studies done by NREL and other organizations of the state of the market at the time that we release a version of SAM. So these numbers, these default numbers that we're looking at now in this community solar case in the beta version, are actually the default values for a 50 megawatt PPA single owner project. And so again, in general, if you don't have costs for your project yet, you can go ahead and just use the default values. And then as you proceed in your analysis and gather more data, then you can update these numbers to make them more accurate for your work. So the operating costs, we have this $17 per kilowatt year. That's based on sort of the results of these cost studies, based on the fleet of PV systems out there. And so this is a rough estimate of what it would cost for a large PPA project. If you don't have better information, you can just go with this number. It's better than nothing. But I'd recommend doing some of your own research into operating costs to come up with a number that's appropriate for your analysis. This particular number includes things like inverter replacement and any labor required for periodic checking of connections and tracker equipment, and that sort of thing. And these costs in SAM come from an NREL project called the Annual Technology Baseline, or ATB. So if you search NREL ATB, you'll find a website devoted to these costs and with references to the documents where the costs come from. So if you're interested in investigating these costs, these default costs more, you could check out the NREL ATB. And then I guess one more point just is that for the community solar model, these operating costs are associated with the system. And then we have another set of operating expenses that are associated with managing the community solar project. So this is for subscriber management and that sort of thing. And this is for maintaining the equipment in the system.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. There is a question sort of related to digging into the details of the financial models, which brought up another question. Will the send to Excel options for the cash flow be available for the community solar model?
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things that aren't working in the beta. One is send to Excel with equations. For those of you who don't know, this is a feature that will take the inputs from the input pages in SAM and send them to a pre-built Excel workbook that comes with your SAM installation. And then that Excel workbook has an implementation of the cash flow model that's consistent with its implementation in SAM. So SAM has this cash flow model implemented, as a C++ program, but we've made a copy of it in Excel. And so this is a way for you to export the data from SAM to an Excel workbook, and then you can explore the calculations there to better understand how SAM's cash flow calculations are working. And you could even take that model and modify it and adapt it, to use as a financial pro forma for your analysis. So we will have that working for the release, fingers crossed. And there's also a PDF report that we'll be modifying and updating to work with the community solar model. So that this create report command sends data from your SAM case to a PDF file that's formatted with tables and graphs. That's kind of a summary of your analysis that you can use to share with colleagues.
Great, thanks, Paul. A couple of questions that have come in that I think we've answered, but just worth answering to the broader audience was whether or not we release a Linux version of SAM, which we do. We don't typically build Linux betas unless there's a special request. So if you would like a beta version with this community solar model built for Linux, you can email SAM support. But for the full release, as Paul is going to demonstrate, we do have downloads for Windows and Mac and Linux. And then another question was looking at whether or not this model would be available in PySAM, which is SAM's Python wrapper. And the answer for that one for the broader audience is that yes, we will release a new version of PySAM shortly after we release the full SAM release. And it will include the new community solar model. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Paul.
No, that sounds good.
We have still some more questions, actually. There was a question from Linda looking at whether or not there's a place to look at the algorithms that were used in the demo you did of optimizing the parameters for the financial performance. And I've asked Linda if perhaps we could unmute her to get a little more detail on that question. Linda, I've unmuted you, but I think you were muted on your end. Could you give a little more detail?
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I was just watching the optimization that you're doing with the parameters, and I was wondering if we could, instead of having kind of a blind guess, have some sort of intelligent approach around looking at what, which factors have more leverage in the financial model. That maybe everybody knows this. Maybe you can point me to where the algorithms are.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I mean the answer is no. We don't really have any algorithms for figuring out which inputs to focus on. It was just kind of a wild guess. I did some experimenting before the webinar to come up with the bill credits and the fixed payments here. So I guess my comment on that would just be that you can run some of these parametric studies yourself to identify the parameters that tend to be most that your results tend to be most sensitive to. It's going to be a little different for different people depending on what they're modeling and which parameters they can adjust. But I will say that one parameter that has to which metrics like the NPV is very sensitive, aside from the inflation and real discount rate, which you would expect, is debt, because debt both affects the size of the initial investment and the operating expenses of the project, the debt repayment, the annual debt repayment, and the investment costs both change. So small changes in the debt, in the size of debt, can have a big change in the NPV and internal rate of return. So that might be a starting point.
Thank you.
Paul, could I also add on this, what do we call it, the tornado chart macro as a possible place to do some of that investigation as well?
Right, so we can, this macro here, so I just went to the macros page by clicking macros down here at the bottom under simulate. And so these macros, these are little mini programs or scripts that come with SAM that can perform various tasks. And this one creates a tornado chart. So you could use it to do a sensitivity analysis. You could put the size of debt. And I guess I won't have time to set it up right now, but you select a series of inputs over here and then run the macro, and it creates a plot like this that can help you identify parameters that are most that have a high sensitivity effect on the results.
Great, thanks, Paul. We're just about at the top of the hour. There's one more question that we can maybe go ahead and wrap up with, which is just, I think you had mentioned that in the past we'd had people hack the single owner model to simulate community solar, and there is someone asking if we have any type of template for what that approach looked like.
We don't really have a template. I can just, whoops, we're using a beta version. So anyway, here, this is the single owner model combined with PV watts. And basically the hack is pretty straightforward. It's just that, you know, we don't have inputs for the community solar model. So one thing we can do is treat so revenue from the community solar project as an incentive, and you know, the incentives can be calculated on a $1 per kilowatt hour basis, or $1 per kilowatt, or a fixed dollar amount. So those would be reported as incentives in the results, but they would affect the revenue of the project. You'd also obviously need to zero out the PPA price, so you're not including PPA revenue and community solar revenue. And then for the costs of the project, you know, the subscription costs, you just need to include that in your operating costs. And those would be rolled up in the system operating expenses. And you should get pretty similar results if using that approach to the new community solar model. You just have to be flexible in your interpretation of what these outputs mean. So these operating expenses in the cash flow would be, you know, include expenses for the community solar project. And then the revenue would be, if we would be this total IBI income, you know, that would be or you'd look at the incentive income in the cash flow and treat that as revenue from the community solar project. So I think it's a fairly straightforward hack, as I'm calling it. That's the basic approach.
Great, thank you, Paul. I think we've dug to the bottom of the pile of questions, other than several thanks from some of the attendees for a great webinar.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining in and for your great questions. We'll be posting a link to this recording on the events page in the next couple of days, and then after a couple months, it'll get moved over to the there will be a new community solar page under here, and we'll put a link to the both the recording to the webinar and a copy of the presentation slides on that page. So thank you